Bravo, Qualcomm. I am so impressed by this. Now, I do want to say that this is extremely impressive for the X Elite, especially considering the really good multi-core performance, because if this was an Intel x86 machine, this would have already been so low that I would have had to plug it in. It literally would have died after all this performance testing. So I've got to say, I am shocked and so glad that we finally have a good ARM-based chip in a Windows laptop with the X Elite. Overall, for snappiness, web browsing, multi-core CPU performance, especially in longer term tasks like Cinebench, this thing is killing it. Absolutely amazing laptop right here with the X Elite chip. I can say that finally Windows laptops are amazing again, especially in terms of value, thanks to the X Elite chip. Bravo, Qualcomm. I am so impressed by this. Now jumping into performance, I want to do a quick battery life checkup, and surprisingly, the Samsung's at 92%, while the MacBook's at 91%. So somehow the Samsung is winning. Wow, X Elite chip on basically standby, doing well so far. I've got Crystal Diskmark open right here on the Samsung with the 1TB SSD. This MacBook Air actually has a 512, so the write speed should be slower. This is technically the $1,700 version. Of course, it's $1,900 if you get 1TB, so it does become more expensive if they're similarly spec'd. So let's run this. It looks like the Book 4 Edge is about 250 megabytes per second faster in terms of the read speed, but in terms of the write, the MacBook's about 140 faster, so they're really close and both fast enough. And now let's jump into Geekbench 6. You can see both of these have 16 gigabytes of RAM. We have the Apple M3 on the right, and we have the best SKU of the X Elite. Yes, that's the 84 SKU that clocks up to 4.2 gigahertz dual core boost. So this is the only laptop that you can get the best chip in. So let's run the CPU test. We have our scores, and look at that. The MacBook has over 3,000 points in single core, so it's 8.5% faster than the Book 4 Edge with the X Elite 84 SKU. But this Samsung is quite a bit faster in terms of multi-core, 14.5% faster to be exact. Now, keep in mind, this is on battery power with best performance enabled. You can see it right here. And of course, this machine does get quite a lot faster, over 15,500 points if you plug it into power. But because the main selling point of the X Elite chip is battery life, I want to test everything on battery power, because what's the point of buying one of these X Elite laptops if you have to be plugged in to get the full performance? So we're testing it like this, but keep in mind, you can get more performance if you plug in. And
it's time for big event that finally Windows laptops are top-notch. They can compete with all of Apple devices in this category, especially MacBook. Like this Snapdragon chip is amazing.
Speaking of CPU performance, let's jump into Cinebench 2024 to test the multi-core performance. Let's just start with a single run to start. And holy smokes, the fan is going insane on this laptop. Of course, we have no fans on the MacBook Air, so it's not gonna be able to stay as cool. And wow, guys, I cannot believe this difference. The Samsung got 969 points compared to 592 on the 15-inch M3 MacBook Air. That makes this X Elite 64% faster in this test, despite only being 14.5% faster in Geekbench 6's multi-core test. And that is probably, of course, due to this MacBook Air being fanless, which is its biggest downside in terms of long-term, all-out, 100% CPU workloads. Now, I really wanted to test the GPU benchmark within Cinebench 2024, but it looks like the X Elite cannot run it because it, I think, doesn't have ray tracing support. support, so it can't even run this test while the M3 does. So let's do Blender. Now let's test something that is ARM64 native, which is the regular version of Lightroom right here on the Samsung. You can see ARM64. So what I have right here is 50 42 megapixel images set up on both of these. So let's test out the snappiness and how quickly it loads up before we export them. All right, let's click right. And it looks like both of them are loading pretty quickly. Nice and quick on the Samsung. Keeping up very well. The only downside is I can hear the fans already. We got the same output settings on both, JPEG small, 90%. We have screen output sharpening set to standard, everything's the same. Let's go ahead and export. And wow, I was not expecting this. Even without GPU acceleration, the Book 4 Edge finished in 1 minute and 16 seconds compared to 1 minute and 42 on the M3 MacBook Air. So that is actually very, very fast. This CPU is working so well. And just in case you're curious, I have Lightroom Classic right here, which is gonna be emulated an x86 app with the X Elite, so we can see how much performance you lose if it's not native. I'm gonna change the settings to exactly what we had in the native version. We have quality 90, we have sharpen, screen standard on both. Let's see what we get. And look at that. The funny thing is that the scores actually switched a little bit. The M3 now took 1 minute and 18 seconds, so it got a performance boost in Lightroom Classic, while the X Elite slowed down to 1 minute and 31 seconds, which is honestly still very fast and impressive, even with emulating x86, so I'd say it still works just fine in emulation. Whew, all right guys, that was a bunch of performance testing. So with all of that said, it's time to do the final battery life test before I jump into my conclusion and my thoughts. Let's look at the X Elite Book 4 Edge. What do we have? 40% battery life remaining. Wow, that's pretty good for all that testing. It's been a few hours of me filming this, and on the Mac, 48%. So the M3 15-inch MacBook Air is definitely better in terms of battery life. Keep in mind, it does have a larger battery by about 19.5%, so that's quite interesting. Now, I do want to say that this is extremely impressive for the X Elite, especially considering the really, really good multi-core performance, because if this was an Intel x86 machine, this would have already been so low that I would have had to plug it in. It literally would have died after all this performance testing. So I've got to say, I am shocked and so glad that we finally have a good ARM-based chip in a Windows laptop with the X Elite. Overall, for snappiness, web browsing, multi-core CPU performance, especially in longer term tasks like Cinebench, this thing is killing it. Absolutely amazing laptop right here with the X Elite